Breaking news! There's a matcha shortage. But maybe you knew that already. I mean, people have been talking about it since the second half of last year. So if you're deep in the matcha rabbit hole, you've probably been inundated with podcasts, articles, and blog posts about the shortage. So as a tea professional and tea ceremony practitioner, I thought it'd be prudent to express my thoughts and opinions on what is going on, how we got to this state in the industry, and what this might mean moving forward. Put simply, this shortage is one of supply and demand. Demand has been rising steadily, but a recent surge has meant that supply has struggled to keep up with it. And this pressure can be felt at every point along the supply chain. Since you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with this recent demand spike, and if you started drinking matcha in the past 1 to 2 years, you're probably part of it. So I'll focus more of my time here exploring the supply side of the issue. If you've seen any of my videos before, you probably know that before I address the current issue, I'll give you a deep contextual breakdown of the history of the matcha industry and the way that the supply chain works. Put simply, the matcha supply chain is as follows. Farmers grow the tea and harvest it. The freshly picked leaves are taken to a processing facility where they are turned into crude tencha. This crude tencha is then refined into refined tencha. In the refining process, roughly 50% of the tea is sorted out. This refined tencha is then sold on the wholesale market to tea blenders who blend it and then grind it and either sell it directly to a customer or send it to cafes or distributors. With this framework in mind, let's look at how the matcha industry got to where it is today and how the recent uptick in demand has stressed each link along the supply chain. For centuries, tea in Japan was a luxury enjoyed by nobles, samurai, and wealthy merchants. And for the majority of this time, this tea was matcha. For the first 700 years of matcha production, from around 1200 to 1900, all of the tea in Japan was only ever harvested once per year and picked by hand. While the amount of tea produced steadily increased throughout Japan's history, the exclusivity, price, and sheer manual labor that went into it meant that the production of raw, crude tencha never really exceeded 40 tons. And keep in mind, all of this tea was ground by hand into matcha. After processing, refining, and grinding, the actual amount of matcha produced was closer to around 20 tons. To put this into perspective, that's enough tea for about 27,000 people to have one bowl of usucha every day for a year. And keep in mind, these people were actually drinking koicha most of the time anyway. For the latter 250 years of this 700-year time span, Japan had adopted a closed border policy called sakoku, which meant that the matcha-consuming populace never really grew or shrank. It remained relatively stable. At this point in history, matcha was bought as tencha, the raw material, and ground at home by the customer. Although some could be bought at the store ground by hand, there's a story of like 5 old women sitting outside of a tea store in Kyoto just grinding tea all day. That was in 1902. The first major sign of change was in 1868 when Japan was forced to open its doors, thanks Commodore Perry, and the rapid westernization saw a complete evaporation of any interest in traditional Japanese culture, and so the production of matcha dropped to a record low of only 4 tons. After a few years of rapid westernization, Japan swung back hard in the other direction, doubling down on traditional culture and promoting tea ceremony in schools and making it part of formal women's education. This is an interesting part in Japanese tea history and something that will be talked about in another video. This heralded another big change as industrialization made its way to the matcha industry. The first electric tea mill was invented in 1912, and soon after, in the late 20s, the concept of refrigerated grinding and airtight packaging made the sale of matcha rather than tencha the predominant way of selling. With this, production began to increase and had already doubled by the end of the 1920s, reaching about 45 tons. In doing so, matcha found some new customers outside of the tea room. People started using the lower quality matcha to make ice cream, to make sweets, and to make a traditional treat called uji shimizu, where you mix some matcha with sugar and some cold water for a refreshing treat on a summer day. To meet this demand and to fuel the rapidly growing Japanese military, the Japanese government in the 1930s pushed towards making cheap tencha using sencha machines rather than tencha machines, and to grind this cheap tencha using other sorts of mechanical grinders, such as compression grinders and shear grinders and ball and bead mills. This was the birth of the culinary sector of the matcha industry, or kakoyo, or processing matcha as it's known in Japan. Specifically, the use of sencha machines to make low-quality tencha is called moga. Keep this in mind. While this research was funded in the 30s, it didn't really take off straight away, and the main growth was in the traditional high-end style of matcha. But things changed in 1985. Before we get into that, let's take a brief snapshot of what the matcha industry looked like in Kyoto in the mid to late 1970s. Kyoto Prefecture is the home of Ujicha and is seen as the center of matcha production, especially culturally. At this point, virtually all of the 120 tons of tencha harvested annually were picked by hand from traditional Honzu straw-shaded tea farms, and these plants were actually mostly seed-grown zirai, which is almost unheard of these days. Cultivars were new to the scene, and some, like Asahi, were beginning to get a little bit popular, but it was still mostly zirai. Kyoto tencha at this point had an average wholesale value of around 9,000 yen per kilogram. In neighboring Aichi Prefecture, people started to use mechanical plucking. These are the riding-style hedge trimmer-like devices that pick tea instead of your hands. Over there, the prices went down to less than half that of Kyoto, around 3,000 to 4,000 yen per kilogram. This takes us to 1985, the year of The Breakfast Club, The Goonies, Back to the Future, and the explosion of culinary matcha. In response to this, Kyoto Prefecture started using mechanical harvesting for the first time in 1985, and regions around Kyoto Prefecture that used to only make sencha started producing tencha to meet this rising demand. This included Ujitawara in 1985, Ryotan in 1988, and Wazaka in 1989. Meanwhile, over in Mie Prefecture, production of this moga, that is, low-quality tencha made on sencha machines, was beginning in earnest in 1985. A decade later, in 1995, Kyoto's tencha production had doubled to around 240 tons, and this was split 50-50 between handpicking and mechanical harvest. At this point, Kyoto still produced half of the nation's tencha, with the total national harvest being 500 tons. To keep up with this rising demand, matcha started to be made from the second harvest of tea for the first time ever, breaking 700 years of matcha production tradition and history. 1 year later, 1996 marks one of the biggest inflection points in matcha history, dubbed the Hagen Shock. I'm not kidding, it's called the Hagen Shoku in Japanese. This is the year that Häagen-Dazs introduced matcha ice cream. And for the first time, a massive overseas market for matcha opened up, and practically overnight, tencha prices shot up over 150%. This kickstarted an even bigger explosion in the culinary food processing sector of the matcha industry, which was given another boost in 2005 by the Starbucks Shock, or Starbucks Shock. This was when Starbucks introduced a matcha latte. In 2012, the national tencha harvest had risen to 1,400 tons, and by 2023, the last year that we have reliable data for, this had almost tripled to 4,000 tons. This is still only 5.6% of the total tea harvest in Japan, the other 94.4% being everything else, sencha, hojicha, bancha, gyokuro, etc. What this doesn't reflect is the actual quality of this tencha. Only 5% of it is hand-picked, and roughly half of it comes from second harvest teas or even later. While some of these numbers are hard to compute, it's estimated that the actual production of traditional high-quality tencha is only around 1,300 tons, or roughly 1/3 of the total tencha production. To put this into perspective, that's enough tea for about 2 million people to have one bowl of usucha per day for a year. Coincidentally, the number of tea ceremony practitioners in Japan is also around 2 million. Again, some of these numbers are ballpark figures, except for the total annual harvest ones, those are accurate, but this is roughly where the industry is at. So that brings us to today with the current matcha shortage. So what exactly happened? There are a few things going on here, so I'll try and break them down and see if we can get some sort of clear picture by the end of this. One thing that did happen is a push towards higher quality teas to be used in lattes and mixed drinks. For a few years now, we've seen a push towards ceremonial grade, and you'll know that I have personal issues with this term. Please see my video over here. it doesn't mean anything, but what it does mean generally is higher quality than what you're using before. As more and more people start to drink matcha and more people want to drink higher quality matcha, this puts the stress on the industry closer to the smaller, higher end side and away from the large commercial culinary side. On top of this, the recent weak yen in Japan has led to an influx of tourists, especially to Kyoto, where more people have been exposed to matcha and people have been buying tea from the traditional blending houses, such as Marikyu Koyama-en or Ippodo or Yamamasa Koyama-en, etc. These traditional blending houses have been mostly selling their tea directly to tea ceremony practitioners, or even to the schools of tea ceremony themselves. This has been the primary customer of high-end tea in Japan for centuries. As I said earlier, roughly 2 million bowls worth of tea, and there's roughly 2 million tea ceremony practitioners in Japan. These teas have gone viral, creating a sort of feedback loop where more people want higher quality tea, more high quality tea goes viral, and more people try and buy said high quality tea until there's none left. This is what happened in the second half of 2024 when some of the largest matcha producers in Japan announced that they would stop selling tea to new wholesale customers and put a cap on the amount of tea being sold to retail customers. This doesn't mean sales stopped completely, but it meant that the biggest tea producer couldn't keep up. And so let's take a look down the supply chain of how this happened. Of course, the last step that goes into making matcha before selling it is grinding it, and this is one of the slowest parts of the entire process. A traditional stone mill takes about an hour to produce 40 grams of matcha. That's not very much, and that takes a while. The latest data that I have from the mid-2010s is that there are around 7,500 stone mills in Japan. Each mill is considered to be able to produce 100 kilograms per year, so that puts the maximum output at 750 tons. That's not that much, considering that there has been a recent demand surge. So what happens when you can't grind the tea fast enough? Well, you have to order more mills. But it takes about a month to carve a new matcha mill because only a handful of people know how to carve the stone in the very specific way to make all the nice little grooves to make really nice, finely ground tea. So there is another bottleneck in the supply chain. Even before you get to grinding the tea, you have to acquire the tencha. Now, most of the large tencha blenders will actually freeze tencha from previous harvests and blend it into the current years. That way they have a backup supply. And what happened last year is that they completely ran out of their backup supply. This is tencha that they've been storing for years, sometimes even decades, in deep, deep frozen cold storage. And that's all gone. So how do you produce more tencha? You'd have to convert tea fields from sencha production over to tencha production, or plant new tea fields. How long does it take for a new tea field to mature into a harvestable crop? About 3 to 5 years. None of that can happen within a few months' time, hence the shortage. Does that make sense? So if we can't simply make the problem go away by conjuring up some new tea fields overnight, how do we fix this? Soon. One of the primary solutions coming out of Japan right now is the simple instruction to use the right tea for the right use case. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean use usucha for usucha, use koicha for koicha, and use the right tea to make your matcha lattes. Now, I understand you might have your own personal taste preferences, but it is a general misconception that higher quality is always better. Take usucha, for example. Teas that are blended for koicha are generally higher quality than usucha, but they are blended to be drunk as a thick, concentrated paste. If you don't know what koicha is, the video is over here. When made as usucha, some of them can actually be quite bland because they're meant to be concentrated. So when they're diluted to usucha, they don't actually taste as good as some teas that are blended to be consumed as usucha. Surprise, surprise, it's blended the way it is for a reason. The same is true for matcha lattes and other mixed drinks. If matcha isn't the primary or secondary ingredient after milk in the mixed drink, then a lot of its nuances and complexities can get lost and absolutely completely smothered by milk and syrups and every other thing you put in a nice tasty drink. Counterintuitively, you might actually want a slightly lower quality tea, one with a little more punchiness, a little more brightness, and a little bit of astringency and bitterness to be able to cut through the milk and actually taste like matcha. I know that doesn't sound intuitive, and I said that it's counterintuitive, but you want more matcha flavor in the drink, use lower quality matcha. It's the truth. Part of the recent problem is that the complexity and confusion of matcha labeling, I'm looking at you, Ceremonial Grade, has made finding the right tea for the right purpose a lot more confusing, especially if you're not used to the way that tea is labeled in Japan, where they use Japanese. Once again, the high-end tea market in Japan is traditionally focused towards tea ceremony practitioners who know how to navigate the labeling standards over there, which are mostly using poetic names. These poetic names can tell you a little bit about the tea, but ultimately the tea company will also tell you if it's for koicha, usucha, or keiko. Keiko is the word for tea ceremony lessons, and this denotes a lower quality usucha that is drinkable in an informal lesson setting. All of these teas would fall under the blanket term of ceremonial grade, but there is a huge variety of quality and tastes and styles here, so they're labeled for what they're used for. Koicha for koicha, usucha for usucha, and keiko for keiko. Beneath this keiko grade, you enter the food processing culinary realm, which is another huge spectrum of quality. At the upper end of the culinary spectrum, you have teas that are sort of just under the keiko grade, and there's a little bit of overlap here. It's roughly in this area of overlap, high-end culinary and low-end ceremonial keiko grade, that the perfect tea for making matcha lattes and other mixed drinks can be found. It's good enough that it won't be too bitter, but it still has enough punchiness and brightness that it will cut through milk or syrups or whatever you want to put in your tasty drink. All of the teas in the koicha, usucha, and keiko grades are ground using one of these stone mills, but as I said, those are actually very slow and are in limited supply in Japan. So the teas in the upper end of the culinary spectrum are made using bead mills. The thing to know about bead mills is the actual quality can depend on who's using them. They have the ability to grind tea to a powder that's even finer than a stone mill, but we actually don't want this. There's data about this, and we've calculated the actual perfect size for a grain of matcha, and if someone is operating the bead mill who knows what they're doing, they can tune it to produce the optimal grind size. And in a milk drink, where there are other ingredients swirling around in there, this actually won't make a single difference. We won't be able to tell the difference between stone ground and bead milled, assuming the bead milled is done well. This might be different if you're making koicha or usucha and the only thing you're tasting is water and matcha. So with all of this in mind, what does this shortage mean for the future of the matcha industry? The short answer is, I don't know, but I have some ideas. As I mentioned, it'll take a while for more fields and more trees to be planted and converted over to tencha production, so the actual supply won't be able to ramp up to meet the new demand for a few years. Hopefully we'll see an uptick in stone mills so that more tea companies can grind their tea fast enough to meet the demand, but the tencha still really isn't there. So we might see a uptick in tencha costs starting this year with the new harvest in April and May. Additionally, we'll probably see an uptick in more culinary grades to fuel all of the cafes and establishments who want to serve matcha but can't afford to spend all of their money on fancy stone milled stuff. Another potential is that more and more tea companies in Japan will stop accepting wholesale or even retail orders from customers outside Japan. A lot of these companies have centuries-old ties to their traditional customers of temples, shrines, and tea ceremony schools, and they'll want to preserve their ties and relationships and their tea for these centuries-old institutions. On the other hand, this trend might actually make the Japanese tea industry take the overseas market even more seriously. Either of these are a distinct possibility, and we'll see what happens in the coming months. So while the future of the matcha industry is up in the air, I will also be up in the air flying to Japan to meet with tea producers and dive deeper into the matcha industry, but also the traditional world of Chano-yu and all the crafts that surround it. If you want to follow along in our adventures, you can follow us on Instagram, where we'll be posting updates about what we're up to before we get back here and edit the videos and post them to YouTube. I hope that my insight has helped you better understand the current state of the matcha industry, but I'd love to know what your experiences are with the current shortage and what you think will happen in the future. If you want to see more videos like this, or more videos diving deep on the history of tea in Japan, let me know. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day!